Hi, everybody. It's Eric Murray from thesugarhuddle.com. What I mentioned in my previous video on the NFL betting lines and picks is that I've been doing an NFL betting lines and picks article every single week, and I'm going to do it throughout the rest of the season, but I haven't had time to do a weekly video for each week, unfortunately. So please go on thesugarhuddle.com and check out the previous articles I've done on this, as well as this week's article. But anyways, I finally got around and did an NFL betting lines and picks week 5 article. And another article that I do, now that's a Tuesday article. The article that I post every Wednesday is a fantasy football predictions article. I call it Fantasy Studs, Duds, and Sleepers. In this case, it's Fantasy Studs, Duds, and Sleepers week 5. Again, I haven't been able to do a video the previous 4 weeks, but now I'm going to start doing it. So I want to go down the line on all my predictions just like I did with the betting lines and picks article, and then I'll go back and try to break it down as best as I can. Now, one of the things I just want to say real quick is every single week when I start off my article for the next week, I show you who I hit on the previous week as far as studs, who I missed on with studs, who was kind of a mixed bag or disclaimer if somebody got hurt early in the game. And I do that with the duds and the sleepers as well. Overall, I've been fairly decent in fantasy this year, but last week, week 4, I was absolutely horrible. I missed on so many players in every single category. It was a train wreck. It was terrible. You'd think I know nothing about fantasy reading that article, so maybe you want to skip the week 4 article. But anyways, generally, I'm usually fairly decent at it. I've won some fantasy leagues in the past, so I'm not horrible at fantasy, but last week I would have been with a lot of my predictions. But anyways, so let's keep our fingers crossed and hope for better results for week 5. One other thing I want to point out real quick is with a lot of these predictions, especially like studs, like with a stud quarterback, it's easy to pick the same guys over and over again, like Pat Mahomes, Phillip Rivers, guys like that. So I try to mix it up a lot, and sometimes I'll have some weird ones as some of my studs rather than giving the obvious. And then some of the ones that I'll pick for like sleepers, sometimes they'll be guys who maybe had a really good week before, but maybe some people are still a little hesitant about starting them or what have you. Duds, I try not to pick somebody who was terrible the week before because it'd be too obvious the next week. But anyways, you'll kind of understand if you go through and read all my previous articles on thesugarhuddle.com, and you'll kind of understand. But anyways, I try not to go with the same players more than 2 weeks in a row if possible, and I still try to mix it up quite a bit. But anyways, let me go on down the line here and not waste too much more of your time. So, Fantasy Studs, Duds, and Sleepers week 5, starting with studs. Quarterbacks, Marcus Mariota, who's at Buffalo, Matt Ryan, who's at Pittsburgh, and Carson Wentz, whose Eagles host the Vikings in an NFC Championship game rematch. Running backs, Christian McCaffrey at home against the Giants, and Melvin Gordon at home against the Raiders. Wide receivers, Alshon Jeffrey at home against the Vikings, and Antonio Brown and Julio Jones, who play head-to-head in the Steelers-Falcons game at Pittsburgh. Tight ends, Jimmy Graham, he's at the Lions, and Jared Cook is at the Chargers. Defenses, I like the Titans' defense this week. They're at Buffalo, and the Broncos' defense, who's at the Jets. My dud quarterback, Eli Manning at the Panthers, and Pat Mahomes versus Jacksonville. That's going to be a controversial prediction, and I can't wait to get into that and kind of break that down for you. My dud running backs, I got Ezekiel Elliott at Houston. That's the Sunday night game. Marshawn Lynch at the Chargers, and Nick Chubb at home against the Ravens. Receiver-wise, I was going to do a couple, and I'll tell you about the other one I didn't go with, but I just did one in this category. A.J. Green at home against the Dolphins. One tight end, and that's Jeff Hireman, the Broncos tight end at the Jets, and I'll kind of break that down because that's not a real sexy dud pick, but I'll get into that. And then my dud defenses, I actually grouped the NFC East together. The 4 NFC East teams who are all playing against separate non-divisional teams, I think all 4 of those defenses could struggle this week. The Giants are at the Panthers. The Eagles host the Vikings. The Redskins are at the Saints. That's the Monday night game. And then the other game, who's the other game here? Oh yeah, and then Dallas, the Cowboys are at Houston, and that's a Sunday night game, another big primetime game. And then finally, my sleepers, and again, some of these guys might have been pretty good previous weeks, but maybe you're hesitant to start them. So anyways, Josh Rosen, he's at San Francisco, and Dak Prescott, he's at Houston. Running backs, Aaron Jones is at Detroit. Sony Michel. The game, which actually will be tonight, is the Colts Patriots Thursday night game. That's in New England, so Sony Michel will be home against the Colts against that one. Wide receivers, Tywan Taylor is at the Bills, and Kiki QT is at home against Dallas, again, Sunday night game. Tight ends, Mark Andrews at Cleveland, and Jeff Swaim, again, Sunday night game. He'll be at Houston. His Cowboys will play at Houston. And then finally, defenses, and this is another really, really odd one that I did, and again, I can't wait to kind of get into it and break it down for you. Two of the best defenses in football I have as sleepers this week, which sounds really, really strange. Take it with a grain of salt, if you will. But anyways, I have the Jaguars, probably the best defense in football, at Kansas City. And I have the Ravens, another one of the best defenses in football, at the Browns. So let's kind of go on down the line and kind of go start to finish just like I did. So with my studs, okay, so my quarterbacks, I got Mariota, I got Ryan, I got Wentz. Buffalo, they weren't bad against Aaron Rodgers last week, but the problem is their offense puts them in so many bad situations, so many short fields, all the turnovers that the Bills had last week, 3 turnovers, all the sacks, 8 punts, 7 3-and-outs, and the Bills' defense ended up being on the field for well over 34 minutes, so it was like a 9-minute disparity between how much time the Bills' offense was on the field compared to the Packers' offense. So I think that's going to be a big setback for Buffalo, and the fact that Marcus Mariota really went off last week. He's clearly back to full strength after that injury in week 1. Last week against the Eagles, defending champion Eagles defense, who's supposed to be one of the better defenses in football, even though they haven't shown it so far, 390 total yards of offense, 46 rushing yards, 10 carries, and a touchdown, 344 passing yards. I believe he had 2 touchdowns. I think he might have had a pick, but again, I just think against Buffalo, he's going to do well. Buffalo, they had such a great secondary last year, and they haven't been they haven't been good at all this year. And their best player, arguably above Tre'Davious White, is Micah Hyde, the safety, and he's banged up. He might not play in this one. I know he's questionable. Can't remember his injury, but anyways, he's questionable, so he might not play. I know they got a couple other injuries there as well. So I really like Mariota in that one. The Titans' offense is starting to come alive a little bit. Matt Ryan at Pittsburgh. I also was tempted to do both, to pick him and Ben Roethlisberger. Ben Roethlisberger's too mistake-prone, and I just have a feeling he's going to turn over a little bit, which wouldn't make him a fantasy stud if he has a few turnovers. Very mistake-prone. So I'm going with Matt Ryan. Matt Ryan, 8 touchdown passes combined last 2 weeks, put up a ton of points, 10 touchdowns, 1 interception the last 3 weeks combined. They aren't winning these games, but they're scoring a ton of points. Ryan has completed over 74% of his passes each of the last 2 weeks. So the Steelers secondary, they're terrible. Even, they're banged up, but even when they're healthy, they're not very good. So I think Matt Ryan will have a field day in Pittsburgh. And then Wentz hosting the Vikings NFC title game rematch, like I mentioned. Wentz had, I think it was like 348 yards and 2 touchdowns against the Titans in that overtime loss. He's been back for a couple weeks now, and he's looking better and better with each of the 2 weeks that he's played, and I think that'll continue. I think of the Vikings defense, used to be an elite defense. They're horrible this year, keep getting gashed. And the thing with them is, last year, as great as they were, there were times where they gave up big passing plays. Well, now it's happening all the time. Well, the thing that killed them in the NFC Championship game in Philly, and granted, that was when Nick Foles was the quarterback for the Eagles, but the thing that killed them that game, they gave up all these big pass plays left and right and got annihilated. I think 38-7 might have been the final score. But Carson Wentz, I think he'll also gash them pretty darn good. Kirk Cousins is also, I think, going to have a pretty good game against the Eagles, but I don't think it's going to be quite on that level that Carson Wentz is going to be on, and so that's why I like Wentz as a fantasy stud. Running backs, Christian McCaffrey, he hosted, the Panthers host the Giants, and then Melvin Gordon, his Chargers host the Raiders. McCaffrey, and I mentioned this in my betting lines and picks video, Carolina's fresh off of a bye week, and they're relatively healthy, so they've got that going for them. Giants' defense isn't very good, but a big thing is last week the Giants were at home. They faced a very, very similar player to McCaffrey and Alvin Kamara. Kamara poured it on him, 181 total yards of offense, 134 rushing, 3 second-half rushing touchdowns, that big, I think it was about a 49 or 50-yarder at the end there. I just think that Chris McCaffrey, 184 yards, career day 2 weeks ago in a win against the Bengals before that bye week. I think he's going to come off of the bye, and I don't think he's going to have 184 rushing yards, but he could have close to that in total yardage. Remember, he had 14 receptions a couple games back against the Falcons, only had 2 against the Bengals, but I think he was somewhere in between, maybe like 8 or 10 catches, something like that. I turn this fan on, getting hot here. But anyway, so I really, really like that matchup for him. And then Melvin Gordon against Raiders. Melvin Gordon has had, I want to say, I'd have to go back and look up the exact numbers, but I want to say he has like 184, 186 rushing yards combined the last 2 weeks on like 6 yards to carry, something like that. I mean, it's or it might be 176, but anyways, looking real good. Last week had 159 total yards of offense in that win over the Niners, 104 rushing, 55 receiving, 7 catches, and a touchdown. So he's kind of becoming that Todd Gurley-like player that I think a lot of people thought he could be. Raiders' defense is terrible. They gave up over 200 rushing yards at home against the Browns. Nick Chubb had only 3 carries for some bizarre reason. Again, that's Hugh Jackson and Todd Haley for you, but 105 rushing yards, 63 and 41-yard rushing touchdowns. So I think Melvin Gordon is going to, again, that's going to be a shootout either way, but I think Melvin Gordon's going to have a really, really good day in that one. The receivers, Jeffrey against the Vikings, like I said, big plays. He had 5 catches, 85 yards, and 2 touchdown receptions in the NFC title game last year. Last week, after his return from injury, after being out for a couple weeks, he had 8 catches, 105 yards, and I believe he also caught 2 touchdowns against the Titans. It might have only been 1 touchdown, but either one or 2 touchdowns, like 105 receiving yards and 8 catches, something like that. So I think he could go off against the Vikings again. That one, again, pretty self-explanatory. And then again, the Antonio Brown, Julio Jones. You know, I was tempted to pick Juju Smith-Schuster over Antonio because he's actually had the better year so far. But I like Antonio a little bit more in this. I think because you're talking about arguably the 2 best receivers in football with him and Julio, they're both going to want to show off in this one. They're going to both want to prove who really is the best receiver in football. They're both going to be demanding the ball, and I expect Ben will get the ball to Antonio, and Ryan will get the ball to Julio more than he kind of has consistently the last couple of weeks. So I think both are going to have pretty big games. Both of them facing pretty terrible secondary, so they're going to have a pretty good shot at that. Tight end-wise, Jimmy Graham, his Packers are at Detroit. Yeah, Jimmy Graham really hasn't done a whole lot so far in Green Bay, but he had a touchdown last week. I do think, though, you know, Green Bay always finds a way to beat Detroit, it seems like, and I don't know. They don't have real great coverage linebackers. Jared Davis, who was getting killed against Ezekiel Elliott, bad matchup there. So, you know, I kind of think Jimmy Graham is going to actually have a pretty good game because, remember, Packers have Randall Cobb and Geronimo Allison, who are both questionable, may or may not play. So that kind of leaves Devontae Adams by himself. And Devontae Adams, he's starting to drop the ball more like he did a few years ago before he got this big contract, and that's concerning. And you figure he might get some double coverage, so that could open it up for Jimmy Graham. So I just like that matchup with Graham. And then Jared Cook, who had that huge game against the Browns, I want to say it was 8 catches for 110 yards and 2 touchdowns, I believe. Somewhere around there. But anyways, he tore up against the Browns. Derek Carr really likes throwing to him quite a bit. He's facing the Chargers, and, you know, the Chargers, like the Lions, are another defense that really haven't been gashed for the most part against tight ends, except for last week. The Chargers against the Niners gave up 6 catches, 125 yards, and a touchdown to George Kittle, including that 82-yarder that got the Niners back in the game there, and then they eventually took the lead on the next possession before the Chargers were able to find a way to win. So I think that Jared Cook is going to have a pretty big day. Again, that's going to be a shootout, so there's going to be a lot of guys in this game, Chargers, Raiders, who could be pretty good fantasy-wise. So I like both of those guys. And then defensively, Titans at Bills, like I mentioned, Josh Allen, 3 turnovers last week, including 2 picks, 7 sacks. He gets hit a ton every week. Some of those sacks were on him, so he's going to continue to hold on to the ball too long. Running game is non-existent because of the offensive line. They had, I think, 56 or 58 rushing yards last week. They've been terrible after being so great in the past, again, because their line is just completely terrible. So I think the Titans, they're one of the better defenses in football, so they're going to get sacks. They're going to get a few takeaways. They might even score a defensive touchdown. Don't put it past them. So I like the Titans in that one. And, of course, usually in fantasy defenses, it's defense less special teams, so it's also what your kicker does, and you can get points or lose points there. But I think the Titans can have a chance to score quite a few points and get some help with their special teams as well. Broncos at Jets. Like I mentioned in my last video, yeah, I'm a big Sam Darnold advocate. But again, he's still a rookie early in his career, had some ups and downs. And a lot of it really hasn't been on him. The play calling hasn't been great. The line isn't very good. The skill positions aren't real great. And I just feel like, even though he didn't turn over against Jacksonville, who's a better defense than Denver, I could see possibly a couple turnovers there. He could get sacked a bunch of times. It could be a rough week for him and a rough week for the Jets offense, and the Broncos, could get a little bit of help from their special teams as well. Then getting to my duds, Eli Manning's at Carolina. Pat Mahomes is, like I said, I wanted to talk about that with him being at home against the Jaguars. Eli, he's a guy historically hasn't been great against Carolina. He was really good against them with 4 touchdown passes a few years ago in that shootout loss at home. But overall, he's not very good against Carolina. In 7 career games, 13 touchdowns, 7 interceptions. If you take away that last game, I think it was 2015, I believe it was, he had 4 touchdowns and I think 1 interception. So if you subtract that, he would have 9 touchdowns against 6 interceptions in 6 games. So he's not very good against Carolina. And this Carolina defense is better than it was a few years ago when it went to the Super Bowl, to be completely honest with you. Lord, it feels a little bit better because that defense started to fall apart second half of the year. But anyways, Eli, last week against a bad Saints defense, he had an opportunity to really play exceptionally well and look real good. And he didn't do that great. Odell Beckham Jr. had another off week. Saquon Barkley in the Giants running game got shut down. So I just think that, Carolina's got a good pass rush. I think they have 8 sacks through 3 games. Obviously, they're coming off of a bye. They're back home. Had that big win against Cincinnati at home a couple weeks ago. I think they're going to really lay it on Eli. And then the Mahomes one is a controversial one, but this is my thinking on it. So you have the hottest quarterback in the NFL, the best offense in the NFL, and the Chiefs, at home facing the best defense in football. Something's got to give in this matchup. Now, it could go either way. Mahomes could really lay on him, or he could have the worst game of his career in what is now his 6th career start. But this is the thing, he's faced a lot of cupcake defenses to this point. He faced Pittsburgh, he faced the Chargers to start the year, faced the Niners. And then last year he had a real tough challenge at Denver. Denver, a pretty good defense. Remember, for 3 quarters, they completely held him in check and shut him down. In the 4th quarter, though, he went off 13 of 16, 153 yards and a touchdown. They overcame a 10-point deficit and won that game by 4. So he went off in the 4th quarter when it mattered most. But nonetheless, I just look at it and, you know what? I could see the Jaguars really holding them in check. I could see the Chiefs' offense for the first time all year maybe scoring under 20 points possibly. So it's not going to be like that Jaguars game a couple weeks ago when they lost the Titans 9-6. It's not going to be that game, but it could be similar to the first 3 quarters of the Broncos-Chiefs Monday night game. And I don't know if Mahomes is going to go off in the 4th quarter like he did against Denver. So I think because of that, Mahomes, who only had the 1 touchdown last week, even with the 4th quarter he had, I think it'll be a down week for him. Running backs, Ezekiel Elliott. I mentioned, I think in my last video, he's got a banged up knee. So he's had over 100 yards the last couple of weeks, had like 240 total yards last week. Great against Detroit. And Houston doesn't have a very good defense, but their front seven's pretty good. They're pretty decent against the run. So I think they're going to do a pretty good job of shutting down Zeke and really making it up to Dak and making Dak try to be the hero in that game. But again, there's a possibility Zeke might not play. So that one, I don't know if I want to go into it too much just because Zeke might not even play the game, so that might be kind of a waste of time talking about it. Marshawn Lynch at the Chargers. Marshawn, 2nd year at the Raiders now. Raiders haven't had much of a running game no matter who their coach is, and he hasn't been that productive. Until last week, 20 carries, 130 yards against Browns. Still didn't score any touchdowns. I think he only had a couple catches, I believe. But you know what? It's easy to say that, okay, well, they're going against the Chargers defense who isn't very good, but I just kind of think that the Chargers, who actually have a pretty decent run defense, I think they'll do a pretty decent job of holding him in check, and I think Marshawn will have a down week. It'll be all about the passing. And a big reason, too, is there's a possibility that, like last week, the Raiders got into a 2-touchdown hole. That could happen against the Chargers, but unlike the Browns where you could make that up, at least for now, because the Browns are getting better, with the Chargers and with Phillip Rivers, you're not going to make up a 2-touchdown deficit if you don't have the passing game, the offensive firepower. So I kind of feel like the Raiders might abandon the run early in that one. I don't know if Marshawn's going to do anything in the passing game or not, even though he's always been a pretty good receiver. And Nick Chubb, speaking of Browns, they're playing they're hosting the Ravens. Last week in Oakland, only got 3 carries because, again, Hugh Jackson and Todd Haley don't really know what the hell they're doing half the time. 2 of those carries were rushing touchdowns, a 63-yarder and a 41-yarder. And if you go back and you watch those runs on YouTube or whatever, unbelievable. Those were amazing runs. There's a reason why he's a second-round pick. Really could have easily been a first-round pick. Had a great career at Georgia. Durability was really the only reason why he wasn't a first-rounder. But you know what? Was great against Oakland, even though he only got 3 carries, 105 yards. But the thing is, no matter how many touches he gets this week, even if he gets, instead of 3 touches, if he gets 23 touches, he's going against one of the very best defenses in football, a run defense that ranks top 5 and 10 in every single category. And yes, I know the Browns have, I think the second-ranked rushing offense. I think they're first or second in attempts, first or second in rushing touchdowns. I believe they're somewhere in that 6 to 8 range in yards per attempt. But again, they faced a lot of cupcake defenses. I mentioned in my last video, they faced the Saints, the Jets, the Steelers, and the Raiders last week, who couldn't tackle. I mean, the 2 Chubb touchdown runs, those were great runs. I don't want to take anything away from those great touchdown runs, but Raiders just couldn't tackle on those plays at all, and a lot of plays they couldn't tackle. So I just think now you're going against elite defense. Ravens defense only gave up 19 rushing yards on 11 attempts against the Steelers last week, and I think they could build a lead on the Browns, a double-digit lead, like they did against the Steelers, which forces the Browns to abandon the run, and then that takes away opportunities from Chubb. So I'd stay away from Chubb this week, but down the road, you definitely want to look into Nick Chubb for sure. I only went with one receiver, A.J. Green versus the Dolphins. Originally, I also had Devontae Adams playing at Detroit. The reason I decided not to go with him is because I forgot that Darius Slay got banged up last week against the Cowboys. Darius Slay, number 1 corner for the Lions, heck of a player, and I think he would shut down Devontae Adams, but there's a lot of talks that he might not play this week, and even if he does play, he's definitely not 100%. But I kind of feel like the Lions are going to try to double cover Devontae Adams. Adams has also dropped a lot of passes recently, but because Randall Cobb is questionable, might not play, Geronimo Allison might not play, but I decided not to go with that one, so I did leave that one off. So I just, for this, only one, and I went with A.J. Green going against the Dolphins. A.J. Green hasn't had a 100-yard game this season. He had the 3 touchdowns in the first 17 minutes against the Ravens on Thursday Night Football a few weeks ago, but hasn't had a 100-yard game. I want to say, 6 catches week 1. 6 catches, 92 yards week 1 against the Colts was a season high. He's descended every single week as far as receptions. It was like 5, and then 4 last week. Yardage is kind of fluctuated, but it's been under 92. And you know what? Tyler Boyd is really becoming more and more of a reliable go-to type receiver for Andy Dalton because he's still not getting the double coverage because everybody's worried about A.J. Green. So Dolphins have a pretty good secondary. They're middle of the league as far as scoring defense and all that, but they have a pretty darn good secondary, and I think their pass defense is top 10. I know they're number 1 in interceptions, I believe. So Andy Dalton, he had the 4 interceptions against Carolina a couple weeks back. He's not going to want to force the ball to A.J. Green again if he doesn't have to, especially if Tyler Boyd can get open, maybe Giovanni Bernard out of the backfield. So I just don't really like A.J. Green in that one. A.J. Green has 5 touchdown receptions this season, but if you subtract those first 17 minutes against the Ravens, he only has 2. So not really having a great year, and it's not that he's playing bad, it's just everybody's trying to double cover him. He has 20 catches through 4 games. That's only 5 catches a game. That would be like 80 for the season. That's not very A.J. Green-like. Tight end this is kind of an interesting one. Jeff Hireman, the Broncos tight end, is at the Jets. Jake Butt, I believe, is going to be out again, or maybe he'll play, but sparingly. Broncos really haven't thrown the tight ends a whole lot, but the reason I went with this one is Hireman, he had that big catch late in the game, and he actually ended up leading the Broncos in receiving against the Chiefs, 4 catches, 57 yards. So there might be some people that are tempted to pick him up and thinking, should I start him or not? I definitely wouldn't start him. The Jets have shut down tight ends every single week. So Hireman, he only had 5 catches, I think, the first 3 games combined. So I expect him not really doing anything against the Jets. And then defensively, I went with all of the NFC East defenses: Eagles, Cowboys, Redskins, and Giants. Giants, like I mentioned, they're at Carolina. Carolina's coming off of a bye week. They've got a running back that's similar to Alvin Kamara, and I think the Giants could get gashed again, so I think they're definitely a dud. Cowboys at Houston. I expect Deshaun Watson to have a big game. DeAndre Hopkins should have a big game per usual. The Eagles are hosting the Vikings, NFC title game rematch, like I said, and I just look at that and I think it's going to be a pretty big back and forth scoring game, and maybe you could get some points in fantasy with the Eagles if they do something on special teams, and maybe if they force a couple turnovers, but I don't really like them too much. And then the Redskins, who actually have one of the best defenses in football right now, coming off of bye week, but they're at New Orleans Monday Night Football. Not really in love with them. It's hard playing at New Orleans no matter who you are. And then anyways, my sleepers. So I've got Josh Rosen. He's at the 49ers. This is his second career start. Last week, he actually played a lot better than his numbers against the Seahawks, 15 to 27, 180 yards and a touchdown. Had a QBR of over 80, but the thing was, he had a whole bunch of drops, and even Larry Fitzgerald had a couple of drops. So that was kind of the thing is, if you add all of the drops that he had, he probably would have completed 20 of 27 or 22 of 27 or something like that, and he would have had probably 250 or so yards or something, a lot of big drops, and probably 3 touchdowns. So, he's going against the 49ers defense. They're not really that great. Last week, they only gave up like 250 yards to Phillip Rivers, but they still gave up 3 touchdowns. Gave up 3 touchdowns against Pat Mahomes. Gave up, I believe, 3 touchdowns against Matthew Stafford, 300 yards, something like that. So the 49ers just aren't really that great defensively, and I expect Josh Rosen to play pretty well because, again, only his second career start, and remember, he barely played when he debuted the week before against the Bears, so not a whole lot of film on him, and he didn't play a whole lot in preseason because he got banged up there, so I kind of think that he'll play pretty well against Niners, and he could have a 300-yard day, so we'll see. It depends on if his teammates step up and actually catch the football this time. Still probably aren't going to have a running game or anything like that, but we'll see. And then Dak Prescott is at Houston. Again, the Sunday night game, big game for both teams. Both teams can't afford to lose. He's a sleeper because, last week was the first time he went 8 games in a row and 9 out of 11 without cracking the 200-yard passing barrier, which just seems unbelievable in this day and age. He had 255 and a couple touchdowns last week, made a lot of really great throws, and he had a lot of receivers that actually stepped up for once. But you know what? I just think Houston is going to, if Ezekiel Elliott even plays, which is a big if, and that's going to really change the dynamic of this game, I think Houston's front seven will do a good job of shutting him down, or at least holding him in check, keeping him under 100 yards. And with their pass rush, I think they will get after Dak and sack him 3 or 4 times. But Dak does have the potential to replicate and actually exceed what he did last week because Houston has a terrible secondary, much worse than Detroit's, and I could see him having his first 300-yard day in a long time and maybe like 3 touchdowns. And maybe he'll even contribute running the ball, especially if Zeke can't do a whole lot because of his knee injury. So I could see that happening, but I could also see the opposite where he has another sub-200-yard game and is terrible or mediocre, whatever you want to call it. We'll see. Running backs, Aaron Jones, Packers running back, is at Detroit. He led the Packers in rushing, 11 carries, 65 yards, and a touchdown last week. Remember, he was suspended the first couple games of the season, but he came back 2 weeks ago, 6 carries, 42 yards in that loss against the Redskins, and then this past week, again, 11 carries, 65 yards. So he's going to get more and more touches, and I think he could have 15-plus carries. And, last week he had, I think, a 30-yard run, so he could end up having another run like that, possibly have 100 yards on just 15 carries and find the end zone once or twice, maybe contribute in the passing game possibly. So I like that matchup. Detroit, another team not very good defensively. And then Sony Michel, that one was a little bit of a tough one because he had such a great week last week. Even though he didn't score a touchdown, he had 112 rushing yards in that big win over the Dolphins. But I think there's a lot of people that are hesitant to start him in fantasy, take a chance on him because the Patriots' game plan every single week is so unpredictable, and there's a lot of weeks where they abandon the run. But it's a Thursday night game. They're hosting the Colts. The Colts mid-pack in everything they do defensively, which is actually an upgrade from previous years. So I do feel that Sony Michel has a chance to have another big game, and maybe he'll have 130, 40, 150 all-purpose yards and maybe score a couple times. So, yeah, I would possibly look into maybe starting Sony Michel tonight against the Colts. And then receiver-wise, Tywan Taylor, he's a second-year speedy receiver for the Tennessee Titans. He had a tremendous game last week. 7 catches, 77 yards, really stepped up. He only had 7 catches the previous 3 games combined for let's see, he had 14 catches, 139 yards, and a touchdown. So he had 7 catches for I guess that would be 62 yards and a touchdown the first 3 weeks, 7 for 77 last week, was targeted a bunch of times. And I expect that Mariota, again, they're playing the Bills, so I expect that he's going to have a chance to catch a lot of balls and have a lot of yards. Remember, they cut Rashard Matthews because Rashard Matthews wanted to be cut a week or so ago, so that opens it up for other guys to step up, and definitely Tywan Taylor could have a pretty big week going against a bad Bills team. And then speaking of next man up, Will Fuller, who had 2 really strong 100-plus yard weeks in a row for the Texans, their speedy receiver, he injures his hamstring, and he might not even play this week, but he injured his hamstring during the Colts game. He had 4 catches, 49 yards early on, but he got injured. So Kiki QT, who was a day 3 draft pick out of Texas Tech, he comes in. He was a guy that a lot of people raved about in the preseason, hadn't really played hardly at all the first 3 weeks, or hadn't done a whole lot production-wise. He got targeted more than DeAndre Hopkins. He got targeted 15 times in the game, and he ended up having almost the same production as Hopkins. Hopkins had 10 catches, 169 yards, and a touchdown, and QT, I believe, had 11 for 109. Didn't score, but I look at it, and I think he's another one similar to Sony Michel, where you say, should I start him in fantasy? You have to think about it. I mean, they're playing at home against Dallas, Sunday Night Football. Dallas, remember, their defense is terrible without Sean Lee. Sean Lee's not supposed to play. Their secondary is not very good. Golden Tate, 8 catches, 132 yards, 2 touchdowns against them last week. Had that big go-ahead touchdown that almost won the game, of course, before the Cowboys drove down the field and kicked the walk-off field goal. But their secondary isn't very good. So this is another week where you're facing a bad secondary, and I would argue the Colts actually have a better secondary than the Cowboys. So I think Deshaun Watson's going to have a strong week, and I think QT's going to have a chance to gash him as well. So look for that. Tight ends-wise, Mark Andrews, a rookie out of Oklahoma. He's playing at the Browns. This is a really tough one for me. And then the other one, Jeff Swaim at the Cowboys tight end, who's, of course, at Houston. Again, that Sunday night game. But, with Andrews is a tricky one because he has 10 catches and a touchdown on the year. But the thing is, Joe Flacco and Baltimore have done such a great job of distributing the ball. 11 different players caught a pass last week. I think their leading receiver only had 5 or 6 catches and didn't have a whole lot of yards. So it's a hard one because, how much production is Mark Andrews going to have? But the reason why I like this one is because last week, Cleveland at Oakland, Jared Cook had, 8 catches for 110 yards and 2 touchdowns. Week 1, I know Jesse James had 3 catches for 60 yards against the Browns, and I'm not sure if Vance McDonald did anything or not. But Browns have given up some yardage to some tight ends this year, and Mark Andrews, I think, has a chance to possibly go off in this one. So he could have a 100-yard day. You never know. Maybe score once or twice. We'll see. And then you think about Jeff Swaim, 3 catches, 39 yards, and a touchdown against the Lions last week. But this is kind of how I look at it. The receiving core isn't really very reliable. Houston has gotten gashed by some tight ends already. Last week, Eric Ebron for the Colts, he didn't have a big game. He had 5 catches, 40 yards, but he scored a touchdown. Week 1, they got killed against Rob Gronkowski when they were playing in New England. So I just kind of feel like Jeff Swaim has a chance to be an unsung hero because Dallas, they could get desperate. They might have to throw it a lot, depending on what the running game does. And Jeff Swaim, he might be a nice little outlet, a little check down option for Dak because Dak could be pressured a lot. He could get sacked a lot. So he needs to probably check it down a lot, which he does a lot already. So Jeff Swaim could be an intriguing one. Just look for him as a possible sleeper. And then finally, this was a really interesting one, just as interesting as my Pat Mahomes pick. So I think 2 of the best defenses in football are sleepers this week, and I mentioned it earlier. So the Jaguars, they're at Kansas City, and the Ravens are at Cleveland. The reason why I think they're sleepers, though, is because those are both toss-up games as far as how they could perform, because both defenses could actually have poor weeks, but both defenses could also be unbelievable this week. So that's why they're a sleeper, because nobody really knows if you should take a chance on them. I know people aren't going to take a chance on them against Kansas City. Number 1 offense, hottest quarterback in football, still a guy that people don't have a ton of tape on, and Jacksonville hasn't seen anything like him. He's kind of like the next coming of Brett Favre. So Jacksonville could have their first bad week, but they've been so great the first 4 weeks, and they could be great again. So that's a toss-up. And so anyhow, that's why I think they're a sleeper, because they could have a great week, but a lot of people aren't sure what to make of them. And it's the same with the Ravens going against the Browns. Last week, Baker Mayfield at Oakland did turn over 4 times, two interceptions, 2 lost fumbles, but he still had 295 yards, still had a couple touchdowns, and they still scored 42 points. So the Raiders didn't do very good fantasy because they gave up so many points, so many yards. So I look at it and I say, you know what? I know Baltimore is in Cleveland, but Cleveland doesn't really have much of a home field advantage. I could really see Baltimore pouring it on the Browns, blowing them out, and really shutting down this offense. I think they could force Mayfield into a few mistakes. I think they could force him. I think they could sack him a few times. I really think they're going to shut down the running game. And then Justin Tucker, who's always great for fantasy when you think about the defense/special teams, all the field goals he kicks, at the 4 field goals in the second half last week. So I really like Baltimore in that matchup, and I really think they could have a great week in fantasy. But then again, Baker Mayfield and company, they've been strong the last 6+ quarters together since he got inserted as a starting quarterback over Tyrod Taylor. So again, another one where you just don't know what to think, but I'm going to call Baltimore a sleeper because that game could go either way as far as their performance. But they could have a great one, so keep an eye on them. Anyways, that is my fantasy studs, and sleepers for week 5. And please go to thesugarhuddle.com and check out all my articles. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. I now have a Facebook page for the Sugar Huddle called the Sugar Huddle. So anyways, check it out. Take care.